The priest read the vows, his voice echoing through the church, binding the couple together. Sue Rowland pledged her loyalty to her groom, but in her mind, she was thinking about punching him in the face. The vows were spoken, yet she still couldn't figure out how things had gone so wrong. How had she ended up having to kiss this man who was, admittedly, a superb specimen? Ardell City was famous as a center for pleasure and gambling, teeming with dreamers. Sue Rowland was a regular at those illegal casinos. She made her living draining the losers who bet wildly and ended up with nothing. The police cracked down on illegal gambling and frequently conducted raids. But Sue always managed to avoid arrest by pretending she was just looking for her younger brother. Every time, she lied that she was just passing through. And every time, she got away with it. Sue Rowland was 24, and for her age, she was an experienced, money-loving con artist. Money was so important to her that she would almost sell her soul for it. That was why she loved this rotten city so much. Even a street urchin like her could live a good life. One day upon returning home, Sue found Mel learning how to play cards. This made her furious because the kid was only 14. She herself had been forced to become a swindler and card sharp just to support the newborn Mel. Although they weren't related by blood at all, she treated him like her own brother and wanted the best for him. She wanted Mel to stop messing around and study seriously because his dream was to become a knight. But the boy doubted whether he could achieve this dream as a commoner, since not everything in the world could be achieved by hard work alone. Then it suddenly occurred to her that they could change their identity, and all they needed to do was buy a noble title. Sue heard it would cost about 200,000 gold coins, and she felt she could earn it with just a few big scores. She took this on, and in exchange, Mel had to promise to get serious. The next day, our heroine went to see Hector. He was the big boss of the Redani Scam Center. When she asked him for a job worth 100,000 gold coins, although the guy thought she was crazy, Sue was serious. So Hector told the con artist that a true VIP was visiting Ardell, Duke Merimont. This knight was a war hero, better known to the public as Sir Chontak. There were even rumors that he had killed his own brother to inherit the title. Hector's specialty was luring nobles to the gambling table, and Sue was to play the naive daughter of a baron from a remote area. Our heroine walked into the place, already knowing that Duke Merimont would be on the top floor of the building. When she saw him, the girl was stunned. Chontak was much more handsome than she had heard. Hector had warned Sue beforehand that the Duke was very insidious, so he promised to send backup. Just as Merimont cast a scornful look at our heroine, the promised backup suddenly appeared from behind. Sue knew Veronica well. She was a member of the Redani team. The two of them had never gotten along. Her partner introduced the heroine to the Duke, saying her name was Marlene, the grandniece of her distant cousin. Sue immediately played along with Veronica and reminded her that she had promised to teach her how to play recat. She continued to play the role of a country bumpkin, suggesting that the Lord Duke join her lesson as well. Merimont agreed without hesitation. A few minutes later, they sat at the card table with several other shills. Veronica immediately suggested raising the stakes, which surprised the Duke, as her relative was supposed to be clueless. However, this so-called Marlene agreed, saying that beginners usually have good luck. With the tapping of the heroine's heel setting the rhythm, all the players began to raise. The Duke won the first round. The scammer's plan was to give him some hope first, and then drain him dry. But Merimont suddenly told the girl to stop tapping her heel. The heroine's heart tightened. It was obvious the Duke had seen through them. The proof was that he asked one of the scammers to draw the curtains and another to pour him water. But the fact that Merimont knew the situation yet remained silent meant he either had other plans, or he was a pervert. He held out the cards to Sue Rowland, offering to give her a private gambling lesson. The heroine gave a fake smile and said she had had enough of this boring game. Instead, she suggested the Duke play a game of Shakal with her. During the game, Sue tried to figure out why Merimont was looking at her, as if he knew her true identity. Besides, she felt as if she had seen him somewhere before. Suddenly, it dawned on her, and she bluntly asked the Duke if he had ever seen her scamming. Chontak confirmed her suspicion, saying he had indeed seen her about a week ago. More importantly, he knew perfectly well that this brazen girl was planning to pull the same trick on him. After learning her age, Merimont said she would be the perfect candidate, though she didn't know for what. He proposed they make a bet on this game, promising that if she won, he would grant her any wish. but if she lost, she would have to work under him for 2 years. The heroine agreed, thinking that the 100,000 gold coins were almost hers. Sue Rowland was convinced that a highly skilled scammer like her couldn't possibly lose. However, unbelievably, the girl actually lost. It turned out Marymount was a complete novice at the game, but because it was entirely about tactics, he picked it up quickly. This strategy game, called Spell, was based on the epic 10 Years' War. Usually, each unit had unique abilities, and the way to win was to get 100 points or kill the king. The Duke was a master of war, so it was no surprise he could pull off moves no one else would think of. Since Marymount won, he told the heroine he needed her to be his fake wife. Sue didn't understand why he chose her specifically. The guy could have found hundreds of fake wives. But judging by the Duke's test of her, an ordinary fake wife couldn't handle the job. Marymount confirmed her guess. He needed her specific talent for deception, and the person they needed to deceive was none other than King Javier of Vilton himself. Not long ago, Chantak Diel Casa Marymount had received a letter from His Majesty. It turned out he had deliberately sent the Duke to Ardell, known for its beauties, hoping he would find a woman there who could melt his cold heart. He wrote that he couldn't sleep at night, worrying about what would happen to the Marymount estate if Chantak died in battle without an heir. The king threatened to withhold his ducal title until he found a wife in Ardell. Furious, Chantak crumpled the letter, threw it aside, and turned to the window. That was when he saw Sue Rowland skillfully slipping away from the police. After understanding exactly why he needed her, the heroine agreed to the plan. However, she demanded payment for her services. Although Marymount reminded her that she had lost the bet, the girl reminded him in turn that she never said she would work for free. Chantak had nothing to say to that, and then Sue named her price. 100,000 gold coins. Marymount tried to haggle the price down to 50,000, but she retorted that she was risking her reputation, which would make her infamous nationwide. Unlike a normal scam, she had to play this role for several years, after which she might not be able to get married. Chantak continued to bargain, offering Sue 60,000 and saying he could find another girl. But she was confident he couldn't find anyone more suitable for the job than her. Marymount considered it and offered her 80,000 gold coins, plus room and board at the castle. The con artist agreed, and they shook hands on the deal. But while signing the contract, Sue demanded a bonus if things went well. Since the target was the king, any slip-up could cost her dearly. Since she was risking her life, she wanted extra hazard pay, which started to drive Chantak crazy. He reminded her that she was sitting in front of the sword of Vilton himself and told her to remember that title. The Duke of Marymount's family had guarded the royal family for generations like a fortress in the capital, so she had nothing to worry about. Sue wouldn't believe anything without proof, which surprised Chantak that such a small thing could be so articulate. The girl scoffed, reminding him they were at a negotiation table. Finally, Marymount agreed, but deleted the clause about business expenses since he had already deducted the cost of accommodation at the castle. Sue agreed, secretly laughing at how greedy these rich people were. The contract was finally ready, and instead of signing her name, the heroine drew her signature mark, as usual, a little bunny. Seeing the Duke's long signature, the girl was stunned, wondering how he didn't get his tongue tied reading his own name. Chantak put the contract in his pocket, ordered the girl to come to him, and warned her in advance that he would not tolerate disobedience. As soon as she stood up, he grabbed her arm and neck, pulling her close. Just then, the door burst open and several people barged in noisily. Marymount remarked that this was a bit untimely, as they were just starting to get along. The heroine squeezed out a smile, thinking to herself that she should have demanded a danger allowance. Just a few days later, the news was in the papers. Duke Marymount had fallen in love at first sight with a mysterious woman in a casino in Ardell. Every noble who heard the news was furious because each of them wanted to be Chantak's sweetheart. Seeing Sue reading the newspaper, Marymount suggested she focus on more important things. He handed her a book containing his entire family history, demanding she learn at least the basics. She tried to object, pointing out she hadn't asked him to learn her family history. Chantak replied that it wasn't necessary, mainly because from that day on, she would have a new identity, Marlene Sue Sinclair. He handed her some documents containing all the necessary information and told her to study them carefully. According to these documents, Sue was a lady from a bankrupt baron's family settled on the outskirts of Ardell. And the heroine also prepared a story about how she and the Duke met. She also quickly outlined the events and emotions that led to her falling in love, and, just in case, listed who they were each seeing at the time. Sue wrote everything down based on the gossip tabloids, so there shouldn't be any mistakes. Before our heroine could even show him her homework, Chontak announced that he had already memorized it all. He didn't want to waste any time and invited the girl to etiquette lessons. The protagonist decided to head to the capital, Bahu, in 2 weeks. Until then, Sue had to be prepared to transform perfectly into the future Duchess of Ardell. The etiquette lessons were exhausting for the girl, and, thinking she was done, she begged to stop. However, Marymount insisted they continue until Mrs. Keller was completely satisfied with the results. And Mrs. Keller kept saying that Sue's movements were neither elegant nor had a solid foundation. She knew very well that this girl was just a commoner from the Free South, and to avoid suspicion in the capital, she needed a complete makeover. She had to learn various different curtsies for every member of the royal family, which was driving her crazy. Sue was dying to go home, but she had to earn money from Mel, which was why she stayed. The lesson finally ended, and she was free to go see Veronica before leaving. The Duke hoped she wouldn't say anything too stupid there. Veronica greeted her partner with a huffy expression because she couldn't figure out why Marymount had only invited Sue. Although she doubted whether the Duke was really infatuated with Roland, that was what Sue claimed. Veronica couldn't figure out what he saw in Sue, someone always running for money and ready to stab you in the back. But anyway, she knew the con artist wouldn't have invited her here for no reason. She handed Veronica a key to a safe and explained how to open it. Inside the safe should be a bag with about 20,000 gold coins. That should be enough to buy a new identity for Mel. Sue asked the girl to handle this for him and promised to send the rest of the money later. As Veronica took the key, our heroine decided to warn her not to do anything stupid, just in case Sue's connection to Redani was exposed, which wouldn't be settled by just arresting a few people. Veronica said she understood, wished her luck, and told her not to worry about Mel. Our heroine was creeped out by that sickly sweet concern, and she wouldn't miss a chance to make a sarcastic dig. A second later, the two girls were wrestling, hair flying everywhere. Mrs. Keller, running over at the noise, shouted at the lady to maintain elegance. Veronica finally left, and now was really time for Sue to leave Ardell too. She couldn't believe she was leaving the place where she had lived her whole life. Sue crouched down to admire the flowers, casually wondering how much she could make selling the seedlings. Before she could reach out to pick a plant, a man's voice behind her suggested she not do that. It was an extremely rare flower called celerin that only grew in the north, and the Duke cherished it greatly. If the girl picked it, she might be severely punished. After explaining all this, the man introduced himself as Fernando, the Lord Duke's bodyguard. The heroine was surprised that the Sword of Vilton had a bodyguard. The guy looked embarrassed and admitted he didn't actually do much for the Duke. It was obvious he was just a nominal bodyguard, as a big shot like that couldn't go around without an escort. Did you know, Fernando also doubled as the estate manager. Sue found it strange that a place with only a few maids and Mrs. Keller needed a manager. She guessed this so-called bodyguard was just a spy sent by Chontak, which meant the Duke didn't trust her. Even when Sue was a member of Redani, she always faithfully carried out her missions. Even during the tough times when they were starving, she never botched a job or forced anyone for money, because those were the rules of the game. So the Duke felt he could trample on her reputation like this, thinking con artists had no self-esteem. Noticing the lady staring at him, Fernando asked her what was wrong. When she asked him if he was from the South, he was very surprised because he was. She said it was because of his name, which had that Southern feel. Then she added that she was from there too. Sue was completely making it up. She knew a shared hometown was a good way to break down someone's defenses. Fernando got excited, saying he could actually hear a hint of a Southern accent in her voice, even though that wasn't true at all. He told her he grew up in a small town called Masterica, and she lied again, saying she was from there too. Sue grabbed his hands, gushing about the joy of meeting a fellow countryman. While telling Fernando all about her favorite Masterica fruits, she suddenly examined his hands. The guy's palms were covered in calluses, and judging by how he blushed as soon as she touched him, he was just an ordinary country boy. The more Sue looked at Fernando, the more she realized how easily Veronica could manipulate him. Since they were talking about Laranki trees, the guy offered to take Lady Marlene to see them in the garden. He wanted to escort her, saying the Duke was worried about her safety. But the heroine pretended to shed a tear, saying she wanted to admire the view of the trees alone. It worked. Fernando let her go by herself and promised not to tell the Duke. Sue thanked him for his kindness and left, feeling very angry inside that Chontak dared to assign her a babysitter. When Duke Marymont found Sue sitting in a tree in the garden, it was already late. He demanded she come down immediately, but she just smiled and refused. Chontak reminded her again that he would not tolerate disobedience. But Sue felt that sort of thing only worked in a relationship built on mutual respect. Although Marymont said he trusted her, it made her laugh out loud when she realized they were talking about Fernando. The Duke explained that he had ordered Fernando to protect Sue, but she was convinced that besides that, the guy was supposed to report her every word and action to his boss. Chontak kept insisting that the guard was necessary for her safety, so she asked the Duke to swear on his honor that he wouldn't take reports from Fernando, and he promised her. After that, Marymont told her to come down, but it turned out she had climbed too high and was stuck in the tree. The man sighed and told Sue to jump, promising to catch her. She grabbed the nearest branch preparing to jump, but was still very worried about getting hurt. Just then, the branch suddenly snapped and Sue fell from the tree. As she fell, all she could think about was not hurting her hands, which were too important for a con artist. As the Duke prepared to catch her, he couldn't help thinking that even a war hero needed to keep his hands in top condition. She landed right on Chontak, making the fall much softer than imagined. Looking at him so closely now, she suddenly realized just how handsome he was. Sue jumped up, apologized to the Duke, and thanked him, praising his amazing reflexes. She even suggested that if he got tired of his current job, he could come work at the circus with her. Listening to her chatter, Marymont decided this girl definitely needed a few more etiquette lessons. He went to find Mrs. Keller, with Sue chasing after him, begging him not to. Nevertheless, she spent all the remaining time before heading to Bahu in special training. The day before leaving, she spent almost the entire day trying to convince the Duke to let her go out for a while. Although he was firm, she argued that she didn't know when she would be able to return to Ardell. Chontak tried to explain to her that she was now Marlene Sue Sinclair, and according to the story, she didn't have a brother at all. The heroine promised to meet Mel in a way that wouldn't be noticed. Chontak just didn't understand why she needed to see him personally, since she had already entrusted her brother to Veronica's care. Sue insisted she had to go because Mel was her precious brother. Then the Duke suddenly froze. In that moment, the memory of spending time with Theodore flashed clearly in his mind. Sue didn't miss the change in the Duke's face and asked him if he was okay. Marymont paused for a moment, then asked her if she really loved her brother that much. The heroine doubted if this would affect his decision in any way, but answered affirmatively. But to her surprise, Chontak suddenly let Sue go. However, he didn't want her to go alone and assigned Fernando to escort her. The Duke didn't want to hear any objections and urged the girl to hurry. She still thanked the Lord Duke and promised to be careful. When they arrived, Sue made Fernando wait for her outside. The guy tried to argue, but she told him it was an order from the future Duchess. Mel was very surprised when Sue suddenly walked in. He rushed over to hug her, having no idea where she had been all this time. The heroine learned that Veronica had already visited Mel as she had requested. She said he should go to the Vilton Royal Academy so he could become a knight. After graduation, Veronica explained her distant relative Viscount Hilla could adopt Mel so he wouldn't be a commoner and could enroll. The heroine was happy to hear the news and gently rubbed her brother's hair. She noticed his hair was too long and made him sit down so she could trim it before leaving. To enter the Royal Academy, Mel needed to look sharp, so Sue began to tidy up his hair. When he heard his sister was leaving Ardell for a long time, the boy thought she had done something shady and got caught, and even offered to bribe the judge for her. But Sue explained she had just taken a high-paying job. She told Mel not to worry and just focus on his studies. Furthermore, she ordered her brother to ensure no arrogant noble dared to bully him at the academy. But Mel wouldn't let anyone bully him, especially when he was Sue Rowland's brother. She assured the boy she would return as soon as the job was done. When he found out she was going to Bahu, Mel was upset because it was too far from Ardell. When he asked her how long she planned to stay there, Sue didn't look back and said she didn't know yet. Mel lowered his head sadly, feeling his sister was working desperately for his sake. She cupped his face in her hands, begging him not to think like that, promising she would earn enough money for them to live like royalty for the rest of their lives. She hugged Mel tightly, telling him not to worry, to eat well at the academy, and not to be a picky eater while she was gone. Fernando's voice came from the street, and Sue knew she had to go. Before leaving, she told Mel that if strangers asked about her, to play dumb and say he knew nothing. With eyes full of sadness, the boy waved goodbye to his beloved sister. Walking outside, she felt a wave of relief knowing Mel was going to the academy. Now all that was left was to deal with Fernando, who was waiting for her like a puppy needing the toilet. He complained she was late, but Sue soothed him, saying the Duke had given them so little time he probably expected it. Fernando's legs were shaking with fear because before they left, Miramont had threatened to beat him to a pulp if they were late. Early the next morning, the Duke picked her up and turned her upside down. Although Sue thought he was just punishing her for yesterday, that wasn't at all. Because a moment later, his hunch was confirmed as the first gem fell to the floor. Chontak began to shake her, and along with her screams, more jewelry fell out. He put her back on the floor, surprised that her technique was so good and she had only stolen small things from the manor. Our heroine praised the Duke's sharp eyes as she ran away from him, for she had never been caught before. On her way to the hallway, she bumped into Fernando, who was startled to see her running out of the office. He thought the Duke had called Lady Marlene in to punish her for being late yesterday. Everything was ready for departure, and our heroine walked toward the carriage, feeling great. She had managed to keep a few gems, the very one she wanted most. Sue had hidden one in her sock and pinned another in her hair. Just as she was about to climb into the carriage, the Duke called her from behind. She froze, thinking she was caught again. Turning around, Sue saw Chontak extending his hand to help her into the carriage. She placed her hand in his like a lady, wondering why the Duke was staring at her so intently. Miramont silently reached out and plucked the stolen hairpin from her hair. To avoid arousing the servant's suspicion, he smiled and said Marlene looked better with her hair down. It worked. The maids were all thrilled by the Duke's display of affection. Although she was furious that he had noticed, Sue tried to get the hairpin back, arguing that long hair was easier to manage when put up. But no matter how she tried to snatch the ornament back, Chontak had no intention of returning it. Already sitting in the carriage, Sue cursed the Duke for being a rich bastard, but he replied that his wealth didn't mean she could touch his things whenever she wanted. While she was still rambling that he could have let her keep one hairpin, Miramont began to eye her legs. He sighed heavily, bent down, and began to take off the girl's sock. No matter how she resisted, the Duke still managed to find the hidden trinket there. According to him, finding the weak points in the southern defense line was much easier than tracking down the jewelry Sue had stolen. The heroine had no choice but to apologize and praise Chontak for finding them. Along the way, she looked at the Duke, thinking how handsome this stingy man was, like someone from another world. But a man who looked like that could never enjoy life. He had dedicated his whole life to the battlefield and was probably destined to die there too. Under Sue's intense gaze, Miramont opened his eyes and asked her why she was staring at him like that. The girl admitted she thought he was really handsome, and he told her not to even think about it. The heroine declared there was nothing for her to pilfer in such a cramped and boring place, then suddenly discovered some games under the table. She suggested they play a game, but Chontak remembered she never played without stakes. Sue proposed the Duke put up the trinket he had taken from her, while she would bet a piece of fruit. Miramont didn't like those odds, so he suggested Sue bet her. Well, let's say her reputation. After setting up the table, he announced that if she lost, she could never mislead him again. She tried to argue that she hadn't misled him in any way, but he shot her a stern look, and she immediately agreed to his terms. Confident she could win, even without any sleight of hand, she began to shuffle the cards. Looking at the deck, she determined that the cards were unused. This gave her an advantage, because Sue knew the order of a fresh deck. So she dealt the Duke a pile of low cards and kept the high ones for herself. Even so, Chontak still managed to beat her. The heroine couldn't believe he was so good at this, too. Seeing that he had already beaten her twice, she began to suspect that Miramonte was actually a hardcore gambler. But he denied this, explaining that he simply anticipated she would try some tricks on him. He didn't see exactly what she did, but he was sure of her competitive nature and took that into account. Hearing this, the heroine smiled smugly and suddenly fell into thought. She suggested they team up, saying they could clean everyone out and use the winnings to buy country. Chontak felt she was just talking nonsense, so she began to stare out the window. When she heard they were passing the Cloud City, Del Amo, Sue became unusually excited. She wanted to stop, but the Duke refused, not wanting to delay the carriage's journey. He told her to come back on her own dime next time. and she called him a stingy miser again. Finally, after ordering the driver to hurry up, they arrived at Miramonte. The scale and beauty of the Duke's mansion amazed the girl, and she couldn't help but exclaim in awe. But Chantok coldly told Lady Marlene to compose herself. They were about to enter the castle. They entered the estate embracing like a truly passionate couple, with servants and the butler were already waiting for them. The Duke was sure they had heard about the guest from Ardle and ordered the butler to prepare a room for the lady. After Miramonte left, the man looked up and sized up the future Duchess. Her posture was perfect, her back straight and proud. Her steps were light and elegant, like the stroke of a swan's wing. Her smile was simply beautiful. Suddenly, the butler grabbed the lady's hands and began thanking her profusely. He said that if his master had remained single, he wouldn't have been able to die in peace when his time came. Afterward, the butler escorted Lady Marlene to her room, right across from his master's chambers. The guy felt it was too early to live together, so he arranged for separate bedrooms. Honestly, just the thought of that terrified her. So she just smiled and said everything was fine. Just then, the maids came in to tell the lady that the Duke wanted her to prepare for an audience with His Majesty. They took her to the bathroom to help wash away the fatigue of the journey. Stripping naked in front of complete strangers made her feel awkward. While she was bathing, a maid noticed the bruises and scars covering Lady Marlene's body. Sue simply downplayed it, saying she had been a wild child growing up. The maid apologized for asking too many personal questions. Obviously, she knew perfectly well those marks were from recent rough treatment. Realizing she needed to be more careful, Sue thanked the maids and told them she could handle the rest herself. So the Duke had to wait a while. But when the heroine walked out of the room, she was finally ready. He was annoyed that she had wasted his time. It turned out Castle Obaja was only a 5-minute carriage ride away. Miramonte was likely built so close to the royal castle on purpose to defend it quickly if things went south. Just as Chantok said, they arrived at the palace in exactly 5 minutes. The massive structure was imposing, perhaps even a bit excessive. As they entered the throne room, the Duke gently placed his arm around her shoulder, and they wished each other luck. Standing before the king, Miramonte stepped forward to greet him. The heroine stood with her head bowed, remembering Mrs. Keller's words that lower-ranking nobles could not look directly at His Majesty's radiance. After exchanging a few pleasantries with the Duke, Javier asked him how things were in Ardle. Chantok reported on the situation at the Southern Front. It was a total disaster, taking 4 days to restore combat readiness. But the king wasn't interested in military matters. He only wanted to hear about the woman from Ardle. Miramonte shut his mouth and looked away. The king jumped up as if he had just realized the rumors he heard were true. Sue tried to introduce herself, but he completely ignored her and continued talking to the Duke. The heroine realized His Majesty was deliberately giving her the cold shoulder. Finding an opening, the girl finally introduced herself, saying her name was Marlene Sue Sinclair. He glanced at her, saying she looked all right, but was indeed a bit short. When Javier made a big deal about her height, she was just confused as to why he was acting like a jerk. Finally, the Duke interrupted the king, telling him not to judge the future Duchess. Javier made almost no effort to hide his annoyance at Miramonte's charade. He declared that he had never, not for a single second, doubted Chantok, knowing even when he was a child that he would be Vilton's greatest hope. Chantok proved this by achieving a massive victory in the Bellium War. There was only one reason the king might mistrust him. A man who had been through so much wouldn't just suddenly let a woman into his life like this. Javier understood that his own stubbornness was what drove the Duke to bring a bride from Ardle. If he had actually put in some effort, the king would have been happy. But Miramonte's blatant lie infuriated him. The Duke tried to argue, but Javier didn't believe that true love nonsense at all. Furthermore, the king couldn't help but notice that Chantok had no reaction to the fact that he had deliberately ignored the girl from the start. In his opinion, the Duke should have colluded better with the lady before planning this scam. Javier found it hard to believe the story of a noble daughter hooking up with the country's Duke. He knew perfectly well that Chantok could easily wrap her around his little finger. Hearing the king's dissatisfaction with the Duke, our girl suddenly had an idea. His Majesty was just a regular person, with feelings like anyone else. This meant that if you hit the right emotional switches, he could be manipulated too. Sue was an expert at pretending, and seconds after the king finished speaking, she suddenly burst into tears. Both Javier and Chantok turned around in surprise. When the king asked why she was crying, Marlene said her lowly status was bringing shame upon the Duke. It saddened her that His Majesty doubted their love simply because she wasn't some high society noble child. She cried even harder, begging forgiveness from her father, who had dedicated his life to defending Southern Vilton. The king jumped up, apologizing for his words that had deeply hurt the lady. But Sue continued her act, saying she had spent a long time preparing to appear before His Majesty and show him how happy she was. She suddenly looked straight into Miramonte's eyes, giving him a signal. The Duke immediately understood what needed to be done. In an instant, he embraced her, comforting her. Watching this scene, the king announced that he might believe the lady. Chantok shot him a glaring look that sent chills down Javier's spine. He suggested the lady go for a walk in the garden to calm down, while he and the Duke spoke privately. His Majesty summoned a maid to escort Lady Marlene. After seating the girl on a bench in the garden, the maids offered a cold compress for her eyes, red and swollen from crying. However, the heroine politely declined and asked to be alone for a while. Once everyone was gone, Sue blew her nose vigorously, wondering why her snot ran like a faucet every time she fake cried. Suddenly, a man's voice behind her asked why she was weeping. She jumped and spun around to see who was speaking to her. A handsome man with blonde hair and blue eyes stepped out from behind a tree. He offered a handkerchief, and she finally realized it was the Prince of Vilton. Back inside, the king was alone with the Duke. He wearily said he was being pushed too hard. After Chantok apologized, Javier asked him why he brought the girl. No matter how Miramonte tried to convince him that his relationship with Marlene was real, he didn't believe it, offering 3 reasons. First, the Duke and the girl might be conspiring to deceive him with a trick. But seeing Marlene cry so genuinely, the king dismissed that thought. Second, the Duke might be faking his feelings for the girl, just toying with her. This was certainly a bit far-fetched, but honestly, it seemed the most likely scenario. The third option was that Chantok had actually fallen in love with her. But that was complete nonsense to Javier, because he knew how much the Duke despised everyone. Miramonte retorted that His Majesty was completely mistaken, because it wasn't love or other people he hated, but himself. Javier looked at Chantok in shock, asking if he still hated him. But Chantok simply said coldly that he didn't and never had. The king couldn't believe it, especially after how he had treated him. Miramonte calmly replied that His Majesty had simply wanted to find him a duchess. Javier started to argue, but the Duke interrupted him firmly. Chantok reminded His Majesty that they were not brothers, and asked him not to expect things he couldn't deliver. If it was about Miramonte's heir, he did have a child to whom he planned to leave his estate. The king wondered what would happen to the Duke himself once he passed Miramonte to that child. Javier was genuinely worried about losing Chantok, and he didn't hide it. But the Duke had nothing to say to that other than to apologize. After asking for the king's forgiveness, he turned to leave. The heroine remembered Mrs. Keller saying that the way to greet a prince and a crown prince was different. But Sue didn't know who was standing before her, so she bowed and apologized. The girl admitted she didn't know who he was, which made the prince laugh out loud. He simply couldn't stop laughing, and Sue couldn't figure out if she had said something that funny. At one point, she even started to feel like she was dealing with a total lunatic. The guy finally blurted out that he was a prince, and apparently, the crown prince had red hair, and he'd never seen anyone make that mistake before. The heroine just smiled and admitted she wasn't a local. She was from Ardell. It turned out the prince knew someone there named Lady Veronica. Judging by the girl's reaction, he concluded they knew each other. Sue admitted she knew her, but only slightly. Afterward, the prince returned to his original question, asking why this stranger was crying. To dodge the question, the heroine playfully told His Highness that it wasn't polite to pry into a lady's private life. That was when the prince froze, staring at the girl. He was completely stunned, eyes wide, and he grabbed her elbow and started shaking her. But he was just babbling incoherently, and Sue couldn't understand what was wrong with this guy at all. Just then, the Duke appeared in the garden and pulled the prince away from the heroine. Coming to his senses, His Highness apologized to the lady, explaining that she simply reminded him of someone. The girl said she was fine, but couldn't help wondering why these nobles were all so weird. Miramonte turned to Sue, just to double-check that she was okay. The prince's expression changed again, and he asked what the relationship was between the lady and the Duke. Chantok put his arm around her and, with a hint of a sharp smile, said Lady Marlene was his future wife. Anger flashed in the prince's eyes again, but he then smiled and kissed the girl's hand in farewell. Alone with the Duke, Sue pointed out that they hadn't even said goodbye to His Highness. She asked if they were on bad terms, and Chantok dryly confirmed her guess before turning to walk away. He made it clear he was tired and didn't want to talk. Lost in thought, Miramani walked fast, and the heroine could barely keep up. It was getting late, and they were still walking somewhere, but Sue didn't dare ask how much farther. The Duke finally stopped, and the heroine looked up to find they had walked all the way to Miramani Castle. Chantok was about to walk into the estate, but Sue stopped him, asking where the carriage was. Although the Duke was sure the driver would bring it, she reminded him the driver was going to the market, and they were supposed to use the royal carriage. Sue was annoyed by Chantok's suggestion that they could pick up the carriage later, since someone like her would likely just steal it. She asked the Duke for some cash, so she could go back and get the carriage herself. Although he didn't want to give in, she kept pressing, saying she'd give him a discount since he was a special customer. Knowing there was no point in arguing, Miramani tossed her a few gold coins, and she immediately sprinted toward the castle. Watching Sue leave, the Duke just smiled. Back at the palace, the heroine was already regretting running all the way back just for 3 gold coins. Suddenly, the prince appeared out of nowhere, saying he was waiting for a servant to come get the carriage. Sue didn't understand why His Highness needed to wait for a servant, but she just said she came back herself to stretch her legs. The prince thought the Duke shouldn't let a future Duchess do work like that and needed to learn some manners. Then he told the driver to take the carriage to the Miramani Duchy. The heroine said goodbye and walked toward the carriage to return to the estate. But the prince suddenly grabbed her hand, stopping her in her tracks. He announced that he would personally escort Lady Marlene back to the duchy. No matter how she refused, the prince insisted, not wanting to miss the chance to walk alone with her. The girl was stunned by the magnificent view of the city at night. The prince told her that when the first king and the Duke of Miramani first set foot on this land, he called it his beautiful Vaha. Then he blurted out that Lady Marlene was much more beautiful. The heroine was stunned that the prince was saying this again, and it was sounding more and more like flirting. She couldn't understand it at all. How could a country's prince so openly pursue a future duchess? He pressed her hand to his chest, confessing that if he could, he would lock Marlene in his palace, so she would look only at him. But the prince knew perfectly well that if he did that, the Duke would absolutely fly into a rage. Sue turned away, reminding him that she was already in a relationship. The prince laughed, claiming he was just joking, as there was no way he could have those kinds of feelings for a future duchess. But even as he said it, his eyes told a completely different story. The prince suggested they keep walking. She was convinced once again that this guy was totally crazy. Within a few steps, they had arrived at the Miramani estate. The prince kissed her hand goodbye, and she told him to get home safely. Finally rid of that lunatic, the heroine stumbled into the estate, feeling extremely nauseous and shaky. Suddenly feeling exhausted, Sue collapsed on the steps, ready to pass out right there. Just then, the Duke appeared on the stairs, wondering what on earth she was doing. The girl began to complain that she had already had to trek back and forth to Castelobaggia twice. Worse, one of those times she had to walk with that creepy prince. Sue indignantly explained how she got back to the castle, while he just stood there looking like he had nothing to do. Without a second thought, Chantok tucked the girl under his arm and carried her up the stairs like a sack of potatoes. Suddenly, the heroine noticed a maid walking by. She whispered to the Duke that no man carries a woman he cares about around like that. So to avoid arousing any suspicion, in an instant, Chantok scooped the girl into his arms like a true lover and walked toward her room. As they passed the maid, she just gasped, completely flustered. The heroine was shocked by how fast the Duke reacted and switched gears. Thinking back to the meeting with the king, Sue couldn't help but feel smug about how smoothly she had handled things. Suddenly, the girl was surprised to see a flicker of a smile on the Duke's face. For a moment, she couldn't help but brag that she had made Lord Miramani smile. But he immediately returned to his serious demeanor, telling her to stop talking nonsense. The girl barely made it back to her bedroom to change before she passed out cold, exhausted. Meanwhile, a maid came to the Duke's study to report to him, saying that while bathing the lady, they found signs of abuse on her body. Chantok listened expressionlessly, then dismissed her. The heroine woke up feeling her surroundings suddenly become warm and wet. She opened her eyes in panic to find herself lying in a bathtub, with a maid scrubbing her with a loofah. Sue let out a scream, and the girl explained that the madam must have been too tired yesterday and fell asleep without washing up. The heroine couldn't understand how anyone could submerge a person in water without waking them up. She jumped out of the tub and told the maid to get out. Sue really wanted to sleep some more, but it turned out she had to get ready to have breakfast with the Duke. So when she finally got dressed and went down to the dining room, she started dozing off over her plate. Watching her, the Duke felt his decision to dismiss the servants might have been the right one. He tried to wake her, but she just dropped her cutlery and continued sleeping, slumped in her chair. Thinking that no proper lady would fall asleep during a meal, Chantok couldn't help but laugh. He hadn't expected to react that way, so he felt surprised and contemplative. After the Duke finished eating, he walked over and put his hand on Sue's shoulder to wake her. The girl immediately jumped up, pretending she hadn't been sleeping at all, and even claimed she had eaten well. Chantok suggested she go back to her room and get some proper rest, offering to have the servants bring dinner directly there. But the heroine didn't want to sleep anymore. She asked the Duke for permission to see the city. Miramani readily agreed, because in Vaha, unlike in Ardal, the girl didn't have any acquaintances she might run into. Although Sue assumed he would walk with her, the Duke stated he had much to do, and besides, she wasn't his friend. The girl smiled, not missing the chance to crack a joke, saying she wasn't his friend, but his future wife. Although Miramani didn't go for the walk himself, he sent Fernando to accompany the heroine. Sue certainly wasn't thrilled about this, but the guy explained it was all for the lady's safety. Besides, the Duke was a very busy public official, so it was hard for him to get away. Fernando said the Duke had met a lady while on vacation. The heroine was surprised that the local market wasn't as noisy as in Ardal. Fernando explained that in Miramani's territory, there were simply no hooligans at all. That kind of confidence made Sue laugh, because she knew better than anyone that there was no city without its dark side. The brighter the surface looked, the messier the underside would be. Suddenly, the heroine noticed a begging child. He walked up to her and asked if she could spare something. A few minutes later, he stood there clutching a bag of fresh bread. The boy thanked her and promised he would never forget her kindness. When asked why he wasn't eating the bread, he said he was going to share it with his younger siblings. The heroine gave him water and told him to eat immediately, promising to buy more for his family too. After filling his stomach and getting food for his family, the child thanked the lady again. She asked him to hold out his hand, poured some coins into it, and asked if 10 silver coins were enough to make a living in the capital. Then Sue leaned in close to the boy and whispered for him to hand over the 10 silver coins, but to keep the rest for himself. She ruffled his hair as she said goodbye, telling him to go to the Duke's castle if he got hungry again. When he asked who she was, the girl replied that if he went to the place she told him, he would find out. After the beggar left, Fernando asked Lady Marlene why she didn't just give the kid the money. After all, if he used it carefully, he could eat for a whole week. The heroine explained that the money wouldn't go to the boy anyway, but to the people controlling those kids. That was why she suggested helping such children with food, but also giving them some coins. Because if they didn't meet their daily quota, they would get beaten. Fernando was stunned that a lady would know such things. Sue dodged the question, simply scolding him for not knowing common sense. After a short walk in the city, she told Fernando she really liked this place. But just as she was about to turn into another alley, she froze, her good mood vanishing instantly. Sue turned around and started walking briskly in the opposite direction. Fernando chased after her, trying to figure out what happened and why she suddenly looked like she'd seen a ghost. She didn't get far before she heard a familiar voice behind her. The prince. Sue tried not to show how upset she was to see him, turned around, and squeezed out a smile for his highness. While the prince rambled on about how happy he was to see her, she was racking her brain, trying to figure out how on earth he found her here. When Fernando started to introduce himself to his highness, she remembered he was still there and breathed a sigh of relief. The heroine was sure that with a knight protecting her, the prince wouldn't do anything reckless. But before she could finish that thought, he swung his hand and slapped Fernando across the face. The girl was furious at his audacity and rushed to the knight, while the prince, acting as if nothing had happened, asked if she had eaten dinner. Marlene ignored his question and demanded to know how he dared to hit the Duke's knight. But the prince ignored her, suddenly stepping up to her, grabbing her arm, and starting to talk about dinner again. He dragged the heroine along, insisting they had to go to a restaurant right now. Although the prince looked completely insane at that moment, he kept repeating that everything was fine. The heroine decided to reason with him, saying the Duke would be worried if she didn't return to the estate. But the prince seemed not to hear her at all, continuing to recommend an Ardelian cuisine dinner to her. Her efforts to persuade him failed completely. The heroine had no choice but to follow this madman. Along the way, she only hoped Fernando would regain consciousness and go find the Duke as soon as possible. When they walked into the restaurant, the prince was still gripping her wrist tightly, and she groaned in pain. He turned around as if just realizing he was hurting her. The prince let go of Lady Marlene and apologized, saying he couldn't control his strength very well. It wasn't until they were seated at the table that Arthur Magova Charles Clement Villeneuve formally introduced himself to the girl, but he told her to just call him Arthur. The heroine pointed out that the Duke was probably frantic because she hadn't returned yet. Not wanting to hear a word about Chantok, the prince told her to eat while the food was hot. After taking a sip of water, Sue wondered why this guy consistently ignored everything she said. Arthur stared at her intently, asking why she wasn't eating anything. The girl smiled and explained that she had actually already eaten steak with the Duke for breakfast. In that instant, the prince grabbed a plate from the table and threw it straight out the window, shattering the glass. As he ordered the restaurant staff to bring something the girl would like, she regretted not just eating silently in the first place. So when the waiter brought a new dish, she tried her best to act like she loved it. She overacted so much that Arthur suddenly noticed her insincerity. He looked a bit flustered, asking the girl if she was scared. The prince rubbed the back of his neck nervously, repeating that he was having trouble staying calm. Marlene tried to assure His Highness that everything was fine, but he acted like he didn't hear her, telling her to call him Arthur. Once the misunderstanding was cleared up, the girl began to eat. The prince stared at her the whole time, never looking away. When he suddenly declared that she was beautiful even when she ate, the heroine actually choked. He handed Marlene a handkerchief, but at that moment, she only wished he would let her go. Then, Arthur suddenly asked how she and Sir Chantok had met. She told him the choreographed story, saying she first met the Duke while he was inspecting the Southern Front. Later, she accidentally bumped into him in the entertainment district of Ardale and fell in love after listening to him speak. Upon hearing her words, the prince's face suddenly darkened. His hands clenched into fists, and his whole body began to tremble with tension. Feeling as though he was about to be consumed by the rising anger once again, Arcturus tried to calm himself down, gripping one hand tightly with the other. Finally, he managed to squeeze out a faint smile, but it completely failed to convince Sue that he was all right. Then, the prince declared that he never thought the Duke was capable of falling in love with anyone. The girl suddenly jumped up from the table, noticing bloodstains printed on His Highness's glove. Arcturus took off the glove, smiling and saying everything was fine. He said this was his best method for staying calm when needed, so the lady had nothing to worry about. He was truly touched that Marlene was so concerned about the guy who had forcibly dragged her to the restaurant. Then, blushing furiously, he confessed to her that he was completely smitten. Arcturus grabbed her hand and asked her what he should do now. She knew the prince was only 19, but she couldn't forgive his reckless behavior just because of his age. Just then, the Duke appeared at their table and silently pulled the prince's hand away from hers. Arcturus smirked and remarked that Chantak had arrived very quickly. The Duke gave the prince a stern look and asked if he had forgotten what he had been told. Chantak said he didn't know what His Highness saw in this girl, but whatever it was, it had nothing to do with him. The Duke stated that this lady was to be his wife, then grabbed her hand and pulled her closer to him. He gave a final warning to Arcturus to stop messing around. The prince, however, calmly reminded the Duke that he and Miss Marlene were not married yet. Furthermore, in his opinion, Chantak wasn't the type to treat women well at all. The Duke could barely control himself, telling Magova to watch his mouth. Marimonti told him not to push his luck, reminding him that the only person he had sworn allegiance to was His Majesty the King. With that, he turned and walked toward the restaurant exit. The heroine turned back to glance at the prince, whose face once again wore a troubled expression. Noticing her gaze, Arcturus grinned and waved at the girl with his blood-stained hand. Once outside, Sue asked the Duke how he had found her. Chantak pointed out that this was Marimonti territory, so there was no reason he wouldn't be able to find her here. The heroine asked if he was angry with her for not returning to the manor and going to eat with the prince instead. But the Duke saw no reason to be angry with her, as he knew very well that the prince's grip was like a vice. If Arcturus decided to go on a rampage, no one could stop him. Speaking of that kind of strength, Shantak referred to the giants from the kingdom of Bellium, who were as tall as trees. Su confirmed that the prince was indeed as strong as an ox, and showed him the bruise left on her arm. Marimani took the girl's hand and began to rub it. The heroine worried that if the bruise was seen, she might be mistaken for a troublemaker at tomorrow's ball. However, Shantak declared that wouldn't happen and continued rubbing her hand. Truly, in just a minute, the bruise on Su's skin vanished without a trace. The heroine couldn't believe her eyes, but the Duke explained that he had merely hidden it, and it would still hurt. Remembering the maid's words, Shantak asked if she had bruises anywhere else. After receiving a negative answer, he turned and continued walking home. The heroine admitted she was impressed by the way the Duke handled his highness, as she felt the prince was completely crazy. She guessed that Shantak had known the prince since childhood, given that he used the childhood nickname Magova to address him. The Duke suddenly laughed, saying Su seemed to have no fear. After all, even after witnessing Arcturus's, how to put it, unpleasant behavior, she wasn't even scared. However, the heroine didn't understand what there was to be afraid of if she hadn't done anything wrong. According to Shantak, the prince had difficulty controlling himself. He avoided crowds and usually didn't leave the palace. So today's situation was a bit unexpected. He advised the girl to be careful of Arcturus no matter what, as even His Majesty the King couldn't control him. When the heroine went to visit Fernando, she found him covered in injuries. The guy grabbed a dagger, climbed out of bed, and apologized to the young lady. To make amends for failing to protect Miss Marlene, Fernando was prepared to offer up an arm. The heroine gasped, knocked the weapon from his hand, and said she didn't need his arm. She explained that she had just come to see him, and Fernando breathed a sigh of relief. The guy was glad Miss Marlene didn't like the idea, because even if it was the Duke's order, he really didn't want to do it. The heroine interrupted him, asking why he was covered in injuries if the prince had only hit him once in the face. Fernando fell silent, tried to think of an excuse. The truth was, when he rushed into the Duke's office to report that the prince had kidnapped Miss Marlene, the Duke reminded him of his promise to beat him half to death if he messed up again. Unable to think of a better explanation, Fernando simply told the lady he was fine. She, meanwhile, guessed he had been attacked by some thugs and, as a knight, was just embarrassed about it. The Duke's welcome back ball was tomorrow, and our girl had to pick a dress. Su grabbed the first dress she saw, but the maid suggested she try on a few more. She explained that a girl from the countryside, like her, might not be used to royal balls. But since this was a ball held for the Duke, the young lady needed to, be worthy of his status as his partner. The heroine felt the maid was implying she would embarrass the Duke, but she didn't let the comment get to her. Su decided she would show everyone what she was made of. She calmly thanked the maid for her concern and pointed out that, as the future Duchess's debut, she had to look stunning. Other maids joined in, mentioning that, according to them, Miss Lanfranchi would be attending the ball. The heroine had absolutely no idea who that was, so she asked them to explain. It turned out they were talking about Duke Lanfranchi's daughter, who was super beautiful and extremely obsessed with the Duke. When Marlene started trying on dresses, she was so thin that the dress practically hung off her. She grabbed a few socks from the floor and stuffed them into her bodice, to fill out her figure a bit. The maids laughed their heads off, finding her both funny and candid. But then, for some reason, one of the maids suddenly collapsed to the floor and began to wail. She couldn't accept that a woman so thin the dress wouldn't even stay up was going to be the Duke's bride. The other maids dragged her away, gagging her with a rag, while she was still screaming that she would look much better in those clothes. After what felt like a century, the preparations were finally complete, and Miss Marlene was ready for the ball. But she felt nothing at the compliments, knowing it was all just a facade. What shone that day wasn't the real her, but Marlene Susan Clare, the role she was playing. If anyone's radiance was real, it was the Duke of Marimonti. He was the kind of person who exuded charisma no matter what he wore or where he was. Shantak told the girl she looked exceptionally beautiful tonight, saying it with an elegance that someone from the slums simply didn't possess. But hey, Su had something the nobles didn't, so she wasn't worried about it. On the way to the carriage, the girl asked the Duke when the ball usually ended. You can imagine her surprise when she found out a royal ball lasts for 3 days and 3 nights. But Shantak promised they would just show their faces to His Majesty and then slip away. Just as Su was climbing into the carriage, the Duke suddenly froze, staring at her with wide eyes. The next second, an angry expression appeared on his face. He grabbed her hand and, without a word, began pulling her toward him. Shantak was stunned when he pulled a ball of socks out of Sue's bodice. The girl's face turned bright red, and she began to shake and yell, unsure if it was out of embarrassment or anger at him accusing her of stealing socks. Once inside the carriage, the girl noticed the Duke was suppressing a laugh, so she grumbled that if he really wanted to laugh, he should just laugh. With her permission, Shantak burst into loud, cheerful laughter. The heroine glared at him, wondering since when he had started laughing so much. When the Duke of Marimonti and his fiancée entered the ballroom, all eyes were glued to them. The ladies whispered about Shantak's incredibly handsome appearance. The heroine whispered back, asking what kind of retaliation she would face if these ladies decided to pounce on her. Marquis Durand came out to greet them, looking very pleased to see the Duke. Suddenly, the guy's gaze shifted to Sue, and it turned out he recognized her. While the Marquis expressed his genuine surprise that she was part of high society, the heroine lowered her head. Eventually, the girl gathered her thoughts, smiled, and said hello to Uncle Hugo. The Marquis was genuinely happy the girl looked so well. The Duke whispered to Sue, asking how they knew each other. It turned out Durand had once been her target. About 3 years ago, the soft-hearted Marquis had given her a whole bag of gold just because she coughed up blood near him, clearly unaware he had been scammed. Durand was delighted to learn that Sue was the girl from Ardell everyone in the capital was talking about. He asked if the girl had recovered from the rare disease that had prevented her from leaving the city back then. The heroine leaned into the Duke, declaring she had been cured by the power of love. According to her, she couldn't leave Ardell back then not only because of the illness, but also because of fear, but her love for Shantak proved stronger. The kind Marquis was deeply moved by this heartwarming story. After Durand walked away, Marimonti commented that Sue should be grateful he had such a character. Suddenly, a red-haired woman walked toward them, and after greeting the Duke, she scolded him for not sending even a single message after returning from Ardell. Realizing it was Miss Lon Frankie, the heroine recalled what the maids had told her. The woman claimed she had heard about the Duke of Ardell's friend, but he introduced Miss Marlene as his future wife instead. Miss Lon Frankie frowned, making it clear she thought she was the one he was going to marry. The Duke suggested they step aside to talk privately. He asked Marlene to wait a moment and promised he would be right back. Once in a more secluded spot, Marimonti told Miss Lon Frankie to stop being so out of line. She reminded him that they had a history and that to take responsibility for the child, he needed to marry her. But the Duke didn't see that as a reason to get married. The child received everything needed from the ducal estate, and Shantak promised he would continue to grow up without a care. So he strongly advised Miss Lon Frankie not to try hiding behind responsibility to get what she wanted. The whole time, the heroine was eavesdropping around the corner, even though she couldn't understand a word they were saying. Meanwhile, Shantak requested Miss Lon Frankie not to cause a scene at Marlene's debut as the future Duchess. The heroine decided to break the awkwardness. She ran to the Duke, grabbed his arm, and proposed a dance. Smiling, she said it was nice to meet her and wished Miss Lon Frankie a good time. Before the woman could react, Sue dragged the dumbfounded Shantak away. As they began to dance, the heroine smirked triumphantly, suggesting the Duke thank her for her help. Marimonti finally snapped out of it, smiling and spinning the girl more forcefully in the dance. Sue was impressed by his dancing skills and asked if there was anything in this life he wasn't good at. Although the Duke admitted there was such a thing, he didn't say exactly what it was. The girl didn't press him, because if it were her, she wouldn't expose her weaknesses either. King Javier walked into the hall, his gaze immediately locking onto the dancing couple. He approached them and asked Miss Marlene if she was enjoying her time in the capital. The heroine wanted to tell him he should control his son better, but she simply said everything was wonderful. After a brief pause, the king suddenly announced he was very pleased the Duke had finally decided to marry. However, he worried that Shantak had brought this lady here only to abandon her as soon as the wedding was over. The heroine clung tightly to Marimonti, crying and begging His Majesty not to say such things. She said she and the Duke loved each other and that such words hurt her deeply. The problem was, however, that Javier believed the young lady, but he couldn't say the same for Shantak himself. Nevertheless, he didn't want to look like a total jerk by continuing to harp on the issue, so he wished the couple a good time at the ball and added that he eagerly awaited their wedding. As soon as Javier walked away, the heroine asked if his words could be taken as a royal decree for marriage. The Duke replied that it seemed so. The girl was ecstatic inside, because this meant she would get her payment soon. restaurant. After standing for a while, Sue realized she was starving. Shantak suggested she go to the garden where tables were set up while he finished talking to His Majesty. The heroine followed his advice and went outside to find some refreshments. Just as she reached for a plate, someone suddenly handed her one. Sue recognized the voice, turned around, and saw Arcturus, his face beaming with a happy smile. It suddenly occurred to her that she needed to go somewhere crowded so the prince wouldn't do anything crazy again. But when she suggested they return to the ballroom, he said crowds made him uncomfortable. Sue laughed nervously, declared she needed to go back to show off her dance moves, and headed toward the castle. But Arcturus caught up to her, grabbed her wrist, and asked if she was avoiding him. The girl tried to tell His Highness it wasn't like that at all, but he seemed not to be listening, demanding she say his name. He grabbed Miss Marlene by the shoulders and asked what exactly she was afraid of. Staring at her with those wild blue eyes, he insisted he wouldn't hurt her. Suddenly, he turned and dragged the girl toward a certain place. Filled with anger at the prince acting as if this was his territory, Sue kicked him away. But Arcturus simply blocked her kick calmly and grabbed her leg. The next second, he threw the girl over his shoulder, saying he needed to show her something. No matter how much she struggled, the prince wouldn't let go, telling her to calm down and promising they didn't have to go far. Sue didn't even notice she had lost a shoe on the way. By the time they reached the place, the sun had set and the woods were growing dark. When she asked why she couldn't walk herself, Arcturus simply said she was missing a shoe. Finally, the prince set her down, and when she turned around, she saw at the edge of the woods an incredibly beautiful tree glowing in the darkness. To Marlene's surprise, Arcturus told her that was Cynthia. The heroine never imagined the divine tree from ancient legends actually existed, and here it was right before her eyes. Witnessing it firsthand, she couldn't take her eyes off its beauty. The prince's expression showed his happiness at being able to share something he loved with her. He was just excited that Marlene liked it too, like a child showing off his favorite toy. Thinking about it, the prince was about the same age as Mel. The heroine felt there was nothing to fear from a 19-year-old kid, so she laughed and sat down on the ground, saying if he had carried her all the way here just to show her this, he could have just said so, and she wouldn't have been terrified. Arcturus became flustered, admitting he was just really in a hurry. He stood up and suddenly announced that Miss Marlene looked very much like the spirit of this tree. The girl was surprised by his words, thinking that at 19 he should be past the age of believing in spirits. Seeing from her expression that she didn't believe him, Arcturus walked to the tree and touched its trunk. The trunk opened, and in the center appeared the tree spirit, which really did look like her. Sue jumped up in surprise, her jaw nearly dropping, as the prince explained that this was Cynthia. She was a royal treasure, kept safe for 1,000 years, since the spirit only revealed her face to the master of Cynthia Palace. Even His Majesty the King couldn't see it. When Arcturus was a child, her eyes were open, but one day, for some reason, she closed them. Based on the fact that Miss Marlene could see Cynthia while others couldn't, the prince concluded she had some connection to the spirit. It was said that in very ancient times, this spirit could walk and talk. So Arcturus guessed Cynthia might have descendants. The heroine couldn't help but scoff at the idea that a swindler could be the descendant of a divine spirit. The prince explained that was why he was so surprised when he first met Marlene. However, looking at her alongside Cynthia now, he could see they were still a bit different. Realizing Arcturus was so obsessed with her because of this spirit, the heroine burst out laughing. But a few seconds later, she couldn't laugh anymore because the prince suddenly voiced his thoughts. He thought that if Miss Marlene inherited the spirit's bloodline, perhaps spilling the girl's blood in this place would wake Cynthia up. Although Arcturus laughed and said he was just joking, it sounded quite twisted. While the heroine couldn't see any resemblance between herself and the spirit, the prince insisted they were very alike, claiming he loved Cynthia more than anyone and couldn't be mistaken. He walked to the tree and hugged it tightly to prove that although it looked fragile, it wouldn't break. At that very moment, Marlene's shoe flew straight at the prince's head. The Duke was right behind them, furious, deciding that Magova was practically asking for death. He grabbed Sue's arm, angry that she apparently couldn't be left alone for even a second. On the other hand, Arcturus was angry that Shantak had followed them uninvited. But ignoring him, he accused the prince of being so obsessed with a tree that he laid hands on the Duke's woman. Not wanting to hear any more, Arcturus drew his sword and pointed it at Marimonti. Sue screamed, begging him to put the weapon away as a trickle of blood ran down Shantak's neck. But he just stood there expressionless. That the Duke didn't care about his own life at all was not news to the prince. Presumably, this was why His Majesty the King was so worried, because even Shantak's eyes were lifeless. Arcturus was furious that the king of a nation had to humble himself just to keep a guy like that alive. Although his father trusted the Duke, the prince himself doubted whether a man who didn't cherish his own life would truly want a woman. Shantak swatted Magova's sword away, saying he was talking complete nonsense. Of all his subjects, His Majesty trusted him the least, but that didn't change the fact that he had chosen Marlene for himself. With that, the Duke pulled her close and forbade Arcturus from approaching his wife from that day on. Shantak had tolerated his disrespect twice. He wouldn't tolerate it a third time, so he advised the prince to watch himself. After walking only a short distance, the heroine realized her shoe had been left by the tree and walking was painful. But Marimonti acted as if he didn't hear her complaints and continued walking without looking back. Sue was angry at his rude behavior, reminding him that he had come here for her. Just then, she suddenly heard some strange rustling in the bushes. Turning around, the heroine froze in terror, seeing a ferocious tiger charging at her. Sue couldn't believe such a beast would be in the royal forest. Thinking the king wouldn't let any animal that might harm his children roam the woods, she guessed it was just a trained pet tiger. The girl smiled and reached out to the beast, wanting to say hello. But after a running start, the beast opened its bloody maw and pounced directly at the girl. The heroine squeezed her eyes shut and covered her face. She thought she was dead this time, but for some reason, the attack didn't happen. Sue hesitantly opened one eye, then the other. The Duke was standing there, the tiger's fangs deeply embedded in his arm, the arm he had used to protect the girl. It turned out that with a flash of anger in his eyes, Shantak had coldly and sternly ordered the animal to sit. The tiger looked pitiful, released his arm, and sat obediently on the ground like a puppy. The heroine watched in disbelief as, at the Duke's command, the ferocious beast tucked its tail and went back to where it came from. In response to her confusion, Shantak explained that it was His Majesty the King's pet tiger. Sue started to complain that the beast clearly wasn't well trained, then suddenly screamed again. She saw blood seeping from the wound left by the tiger's fangs, soaking the Duke's coat. The girl rushed to Shantak, insisting he needed to see a doctor immediately. She made him sit on a large rock so she could administer first aid herself. Frowning, Sue told the Duke to take off his clothes immediately. While he removed his tight-fitting jacket, the girl wondered what she could use for a bandage. When Sue turned back to look at Shantak, she was surprised by the number of scars covering his body. But the Duke explained that anyone who had been on the battlefield had scars like these, and there was nothing to worry about because everything eventually healed. Nevertheless, the heroine pointed out that being bitten by an animal was a completely different matter. She used her teeth to tear a strip of cloth from the hem of her dress. Lost in thought and looking a bit angry, the girl silently administered first aid to Shantak, bandaging the wound. He broke the silence, puzzled as to why she was so serious. After all, he knew she had scars herself. The heroine straightened up, and a large bruise from a collision could be seen on her exposed leg. The girl quickly composed herself, smiling and asking if he had heard that from the maid who helped her bathe. The Duke offered to fire the maid if it made Sue uncomfortable, but the heroine saw no reason to fire someone for doing their job. Besides, she wasn't ashamed of the scars. They were proof she had lived. When the Duke and his fiancée returned to the castle, the king nearly fainted at the sight of them. But when Marlene explained how Shantak had jumped in to protect her, he was a bit surprised, then made a strange request. Javier said Marimonti was a rather unstable fellow and requested the young lady take good care of him. As the heroine rode the carriage home, she recalled the prince's words, which she hadn't understood at first, but now Arcturus's comment about Shantak having no attachment to life seemed to make sense. In her opinion, the Duke's scars weren't just trauma from the battlefield, but more like marks left by someone trying to destroy himself. The heroine used to think everyone cherished their own life. Even growing up in filthy alleyways, She cherished every moment of being alive. The Duke interrupted her thoughts, suddenly announcing that their wedding would take place next week. When Sue learned everything was happening so fast, she panicked. Shantak really didn't understand what the problem was, since the wedding was fake. But she reminded him that to everyone else, it had to look real. He reassured her that it would be a small ceremony within the territory, and the important thing was that His Majesty the King would be present. His Majesty knew very well how much Monty hated trouble, so he wouldn't think too much of it. So the heroine wondered if Shantak would get the title as soon as he married. But the guy said that was impossible, as even he didn't know when exactly that would happen. This infuriated Sue, who didn't plan on staying in Vash for more than a year. She lunged at Shantak, saying over and over that she had her own life and needed to return to her brother. But Monty promised it wouldn't take long, as His Majesty wasn't one to hold on to suspicions for a long time. The girl believed him and asked what would happen to her when he finally got what he wanted. According to Shantak, Marlene Sue Sinclair would either disappear, drop dead, or abandon him. And when he passed the ducal title to the child, Marimani's mission would be complete. Sue had thought that Shantak transferring the title immediately upon receiving it would arouse the king's suspicion, but she later discovered that once a ducal title is granted, it cannot be revoked unless a felony, such as treason, is committed. Marimani spoke of this with a cold ruthlessness, as if he didn't care in the slightest about the king's feelings, which shocked the heroine greatly. However, none of this was her concern anymore. She would soon be able to end her life of playing Marlene. The girl dreamed that when all this was over, she could go to some small village and completely relax for once. A place so remote that no noble in Bahia would ever want to visit. Thinking of this, the heroine suddenly realized the Duke intended to abandon his status. She smiled and told Shantak that if he felt bored, he could join her and they could be professional con artists together. Time flew by, and the Duke became unusually busy preparing for the wedding. Sue was surprised that he didn't look like he was going crazy at all. Although Monty reminded her that this was just a contract marriage, she felt that didn't change the fact that it was a marriage. She kept pestering him, guessing that he was working overtime on purpose to escape his depression about the wedding. Shantak said Sue was useless and only getting in the way, then kicked her out. A maid passed by and cast a creepy smile at Marlene, making her feel even more unsettled. The girl grabbed a basket of bread from the maid's cart and walked to the window, wanting to relax and eat something. She recalled that in the carriage, the Duke had said he would slip away as soon as he obtained the formal title. Sue tried hard to tell herself that once their deal was done, none of this would have anything to do with her anymore. Suddenly, someone threw a pebble at the window. She looked out and saw Django, the little urchin from the alley. She grabbed the curtain and jumped directly out of the window, landing beside him on the street in the blink of an eye. Seeing the child's astonished expression, Sue simply said she had practiced a bit of acrobatics before. The child obviously didn't believe a noble would do such a thing, but she cut him off, asking about the task she had assigned. The little beggar pulled Mel's letter from his pocket and handed it to her. In the letter, her brother said he was very worried about Sue because she had never confessed everything to him, and he hoped she was well. He was doing fine at the Royal Academy, and his true identity hadn't been exposed. Although he had to deal with some difficulties because he enrolled a bit late, Mel quickly silenced those who threw their weight around because of their family background. He told his sister not to worry about him and hoped she would write often. The heroine felt warm inside, seeing Mel repeatedly reminding her to eat well at the end of the letter. She ruffled the little messenger's hair and thanked him for delivering the letter. Then, the girl gave Django some gold coins and said she would be counting on him in the future. When asked how he had been lately, the little beggar said it was the same as always. The older kids were villains and the adults were stingy. Learning he was 10 years old, Sue told him to hold on for another 5 years, because by then he would be treated as an adult and life wouldn't be so dangerous. She gave him some bread to eat before the kid left, so he could grow up faster. He didn't even bat an eyelid, mumbling that he was just about to ask her for some. The heroine found it amusing that he acted so self-righteously in the Duke's mansion despite having only been there a few times. After sending the boy off, Sue strolled in the garden, wondering when she would receive Mel's next letter. Suddenly, her gaze was drawn to a gold coin on the grass, then another and another. As the heroine picked up the coins, she unknowingly walked right up to the bushes. Just then, Arcturus suddenly jumped out from inside, wearing a big grin. The girl tried to force her friendliest expression and asked how he got in. The prince told her to keep her voice down, saying he had snuck into the estate. The heroine was about to call the guards, but Arcturus shook a bag of gold coins in front of her, and she immediately shut her mouth. The prince laughed. It seemed the intelligence that Marlene loved money was very accurate, and he was pleased with this. He said he heard it from Lady Veronica, and Sue wished she could kill that venomous woman. Arthur shook the money bag in front of her again, promising it would be hers if she did a small favor. He said it was simple. Marlene just needed to change her clothes. The heroine felt there was something fishy about this. She politely declined his offer, but the prince's eyes gleamed with a frantic look, unable to understand why she would refuse. Sue was frightened and decided to compromise slightly, at least asking him what kind of clothes they were. Arthur said she would definitely like it, then pulled a long white dress out his bag. The girl flatly refused. She didn't want to dress like a child. The prince was disappointed because he really wanted to see Marlene in that dress. Seeing him so crestfallen, the heroine scoffed and asked how much he was willing to pay. When she discovered there were 300 gold coins in bag, she agreed to put it on if he doubled the price. Arcturus smiled because he had intended to pay 700 gold coins all along. The heroine told him to wait a moment and ran off to change the dress. The prince waited patiently until the sun began to set. Sue finally finished changing. The fabric was unexpectedly comfortable, though the pair of fairy wings made her feel awkward. On the way back to Arcturus, the heroine hesitated about whether to let him see her. After all, she had only promised to put on the dress, not to show it to him. The girl even considered just going straight back to the manor and sleeping in this outfit. It was perfect for pajamas. But suddenly, someone behind her greeted her. The heroine turned around and saw a boy with dazzling red hair standing before her. Judging by his expensive clothing, he couldn't be his servant's child. Sue guessed the boy was likely a guest visiting the Duke. She smiled and greeted the child. He was sizing up her outfit, his expression vaguely reminding her of Shantak. The boy was completely captivated by Sue, as if she were some kind of magical fairy. So she crouched down in front of him and played along with his idea. It turned out this child, who was thrilled to meet a real fairy, was named Beau. Although he had a much longer full name, he wanted his new friend to call him that. Just then, Duke Marimonti walked over, smiling as he called out to the boy and beckoned him. Beau ran to Shantak and hugged him. Shantak suggested they go inside the manor to avoid catching a cold out there. Then, he turned to Sue and invited her to come in as well, since the sun was setting. She stood up as told, wondering if Beau might be the Duke's son. It was entirely possible. Shantak wasn't young, after all, so having a 6-year-old child would be normal. Perhaps he was the person the Duke had mentioned in the carriage. Honestly, she knew she shouldn't be bothered by this. Their contract didn't say Marimonti had to report his family situation to her. Sue felt the air becoming unusually cold and decided it was time to return to the manor. Suddenly, she felt like she had forgotten something, but since she couldn't recall it, she figured it wasn't important. Meanwhile, the prince was shivering in the cold wind, sneezing as he waited for her return in the bushes. The next morning, she lay in bed, puzzled, since the Duke already had a child, and that child obviously must have a mother. Why did he need a fake marriage? Her thoughts were interrupted by an older woman. She walked into the room, introduced herself as Helen, and said she was responsible for taking care of young Master Beau. But from now until the wedding, she would be assisting Miss Marlene. The heroine thought she must be here to replace the maid who was fired last time for throwing a tantrum. Sue was actually relieved, as Helen seemed much more steady. She finally realized that Beau didn't just live in the Duke's mansion. He was the heir to Marimonti. Helen looked the young lady up and down, thinking her attire was quite peculiar. The heroine, having completely forgotten about that, simply said they were pajamas. Then, Helen offered to arrange the young lady's schedule for the day. They had to go try on the wedding dress. A few minutes later, the heroine stood wearing the wedding dress while the maids had already begun chattering about where to add lace and where to set jewels. Unnoticed, Beau and Arcturus had also appeared in the room and started critiquing the wedding dress. They agreed that a witch-style wedding dress would suit her better. The heroine was shocked to see the prince in the room, but he insisted he wasn't a prince, just a passing adventurer. Sue scolded him for trespassing on the estate again and trying to impose his crazy ideas on her wedding dress. Since it was mentioned, Arcturus reminded her that he had already paid and she hadn't fulfilled the agreement. Hearing this, Beau was very surprised that a fairy would break a promise. The prince was about to tell the child that he had paid this fairy 700 gold coins, but she clamped her hand over his mouth and suggested they talk outside. Once outside, she questioned Arcturus about the real reason he was following her, but he just asked her if she was really going to marry the Duke. He even suggested that if she wanted to stage a romantic. that runaway bride scenario, he could help. Sue laughed and told him not to be silly, which obviously disappointed Arcturus. He claimed the Duke was incapable of love and couldn't be responsible for those around him. She angrily told the prince not to say such things, insisting that Shantak had been very considerate to her. Arcturus interrupted her, saying the reason he thought so was that the boy Beau's mother died because of the Duke. The prince couldn't reveal the specific details of the event, but he could tell Sue about the woman. Beau's mother, Camilla, had been Arcturus's etiquette teacher. She was a strong and beautiful woman. One sunny summer day, a few years ago, the royal gardener was working in the garden. The prince, who couldn't control his power at the time, ran into the yard and simply touched a tree lightly. And the trunk snapped instantly. Seeing this, the gardener was too scared to speak. The boy ran up to the terrified man and invited him to play. Arcturus waved his hand gently and knocked the gardening shears out of his hand. The scissors broke in two in midair. The gardener fell to his knees in fright, begging his highness for mercy. Soon, rumors spread among the nobility that this prince, whose birth mother was a Pentanta princess who committed suicide after being captured, had not learned to control his tribe's power. Anything he touched, even royal treasures, would turn to dust. Rumor had it that the child nearly bankrupted the palace. When Arthur hugged his wet nurse, he accidentally broke her neck. They called the boy a true monster, saying he had killed countless maids. Hearing people discuss him, Arthur spent his days reading alone in the castle. But one day, Camilla came to him and announced she would be his etiquette teacher. The boy was wary of this teacher, but she walked right in without waiting for an invitation and sat opposite him. Camilla leaned back lazily in her chair and suggested Arthur skip the first day's lesson because she wasn't in the mood. The boy was surprised she spoke to him so casually. As for Camilla, she thought there was no need to be so formal with a child 11 years her junior. The prince was shocked that she could talk to him without any scruples when everyone else avoided him like the plague. He told the girl that it made him feel incredibly lonely. Camilla explained that it was just people's natural reaction to him, making a mess of things with that amazing power. She proposed Arcturus come with her, saying she wanted to show him something magical. The girl took him to a Cynthia tree that glowed in the dark. She shared a royal secret. No force could destroy this tree. When the boy asked how she knew a royal secret, Camilla just said that was another secret. Then she told Arcturus to go to the tree and hug it. The boy hesitantly walked towards the Cynthia tree, touched it, hugged it, and a happy smile bloomed on his face. Finishing the story, the prince advised Sue to think twice before getting married. He kissed her hand and told her to notify him if she changed her mind about marrying the Duke. When the heroine returned to the manor, Helen told her that the Duke wanted to see her in the study after the fitting. Sue then invited Beau to go with her. He happily agreed. On the way to the study, Sue's mind was full of the prince's words. The thought that this boy's mother might have died because of the Duke made her uneasy. Sue tried to discern if what Arcturus had said was true, or if it was all lies fabricated out of jealousy towards Shantak. But on second thought, strange rumors about the Duke had never ceased, even claiming he killed his own brother. However, Marimonti didn't look like a cold-blooded monster, and besides, he was planning to leave the duchy. Just then, Beau suddenly called Sue's sister and gave her a sweet smile. His innocent smile made her feel that he and the Duke must have a good relationship, and a child's affection couldn't be fake. They finally reached the study door when the child suddenly decided to ask Sue a question. He wanted to know why she wasn't wearing that magical fairy costume today. She explained to Beau that it was only worn on special occasions and made him promise to keep her fairy identity a secret. Just then, the Duke's booming voice came from behind the door, asking why they were lingering outside. Walking into the study, Sue whispered to Beau to keep their little secret, but the child suddenly stepped forward, shielded her, and declared to the Duke, "This lady is absolutely not a fairy." The Duke agreed with Beau, then told Marlene to come to him. She was very annoyed by his commanding tone, like he was ordering a pet around. Shantak chuckled lightly, saying he was just treating her the way a wife should be treated. As she approached, he handed over several documents detailing the wedding schedule and etiquette. When Sue discovered the wedding was to be held in 3 days, she was shocked. Although she was very annoyed that he hadn't told her sooner, she still picked up the documents and examined them carefully. The girl stormed out of the study, trembling with anger. Bo suddenly chased after her. He stopped Sue, told her not to be angry, and handed her a hairpin that looked very ornate. This was the very piece of jewelry she had tried to swipe on the way to the Duke's territory, only to be caught red-handed by Shantak. When she asked where he found it, Bo said it was just sitting on his desk. Sue happily pinned the hairpin in her hair, thinking that since the heir gave it to her, the Duke couldn't possibly ask for it back. Bo marveled at how good she looked wearing the hairpin. Listening to his praise, she thought to herself that Duke Miramonte's past really had nothing to do with her. Now, she just needed to focus on getting the money promised in the contract. With only one day left until the wedding, repeatedly studying the banquet proceedings left Sue exhausted. The meticulous step-by-step way these nobles planned events was driving her crazy. Duke Shantak walked into Marlene's room to confirm if she had memorized all the procedures. She asked him what kind of person he took her for, saying memorizing this was a piece of cake. He told her to get some sleep so she wouldn't fall behind tomorrow, then left the room. But Sue rushed up and grabbed his sleeve, asking him to wait. Since he was already there, she smiled and suggested they rehearse the whole process together. The Duke didn't refuse. He took her hand, led her to the window, and demonstrated the steps they would take walking to the altar. She couldn't help feeling unusually anxious about the whole thing. Sue was surprised that Shantak was so composed a day before his own wedding. Looking at his emotionless face, she said it would all be over soon. She imagined how Mel would scold her when she got back, but then remembered he was still at school, so they wouldn't meet immediately. Sue told Shantak that her brother wanted to be a knight, and she was funding his training. The girl gazed at the Duke and said he probably had a brother too. Marimonte turned his face away, sighed, and replied that he indeed once had one. Looking at him, the heroine suddenly realized that the prince was wrong about the Duke being incapable of love. The man before her didn't seem as cold and heartless as the rumors said. Rather, it seemed like someone had forcibly stripped him of the ability to feel any emotion. Shantak lifted the girl's hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, just as the procedure dictated. Sue watched him silently, trying to sort out why things had developed this way. It wasn't until Marimonte bade her good night that she snapped out of it. She declared that she had made up her mind about this wedding, and they would definitely pull it off well. Shantak didn't look back, telling her, as usual, to try and get some more sleep. The next morning, the city streets were packed with people, all there to see the Duke and his bride off to the temple. Sue complained about her lack of sleep, to which the Duke said, "All right, don't doze off now." Following the script, she smiled and waved to the crowd, playing the role of the happy bride. Watching the Duke's knights toss gold coins to the crowd, she felt like crying over the cost. She really couldn't understand this kind of lavish wedding where the couple gave gifts instead of receiving them. The people's love and respect for the Duke shocked her. They called him the hero of Villainous. This man undoubtedly carried everyone's adoration and sky-high expectations on his shoulders. Sue couldn't help but ask if the Duke's shoulders felt heavy. Shantak didn't react at first, then chuckled lightly, playfully flicked her forehead, and said she was quite the clever little thing. Sue realized he was right. This was just a contract, and she was meddling. She blushed, realizing her behavior just now had been too presumptuous, as if she were truly his wife. Making such a careless mistake was completely unlike her. She needed to keep her distance from this man she had to deal with. Sue had to act like a professional partner, not pry into his private life. Finally, the couple arrived at the temple, where His Majesty the King was waiting. Javier stood up, walked towards them, and reiterated his lack of trust in Shantak. He said he agreed to this because he saw some potential in this union. Nevertheless, the king offered his congratulations to Marimonte on his marriage. As for the young lady, His Majesty had prepared a wedding gift. It was a piece of jewelry shaped like the noble family crest, symbolizing that from now on, Marlene would belong to the Marimonte family. The king expressed his hope that the young lady understood what it meant to bear this surname in the land of Alet. The archbishop was also pleased to officiate the wedding for Lord Marimonte. He placed his palm on Marlene's head, blessing the future Duchess. It was only in that moment that the heroine fully realized the role she was about to play. From now on, she would be the Duchess, blessed by the king and the archbishop, the wife of the hero loved by all of Villainous. The girl reminded herself again that this wouldn't break her, because it was just another scam. The groom and bride approached the altar and swore to love each other until death. Despite the intense desire inside her to back out of this marriage, Sue smiled and said, I do." The priest announced it was time to seal their vows with a first kiss. The heroine flinched. This wasn't part of the deal. Shantak grabbed her hand, pulled her close, and whispered in her ear, reminding her to smile. Then they kissed, and Sue felt the warmth of his lips. She blushed, blaming it on the fact that this was, after all, her first kiss. When the ceremony finally ended and the newlyweds returned to Shantak's room, Sue stood frozen in the middle of the bedroom. She felt depressed that her first kiss was gone just like that, finally shaking off her worries. The heroine asked why she couldn't go back to her own room to sleep. The Duke explained that sleeping in separate rooms on their wedding night might arouse the suspicion of the butler right outside the door. Shantak began to undress, completely oblivious to what was making Sue so flustered. The girl blushed again, trying to explain to the Duke that she didn't have any. Got weird ideas. Suddenly, Monty announced that he had been so busy with wedding preparations that he completely forgot to tell her one thing. He had to leave for the north early the next morning to lead the war against Bellium. After the newlyweds got into bed, the heroine couldn't close her eyes. She was afraid to fall asleep, worried the Duke would see another side of her. Sue turned on her side, carefully examining Shantak's room for the first time. A stack of documents sat on the desk. This boring guy was apparently working even on his wedding day. The girl turned to the Duke, who was sleeping soundly. The thought that even someone like him could be exhausted by this grueling wedding amused her. Sue's laughter woke Shantak. He rubbed his eyes and told her to go to sleep. She apologized, but he unexpectedly reached out and placed his hand on her head. Monty picked up a lock of her hair and just lay there quietly studying it. Realizing he did this while half asleep, Sue was so shocked she didn't dare move a muscle. She suddenly thought of Shantak returning wounded from another war and felt a pang of sadness. Sue reminded herself to discard this unrealistic infatuation. She turned over to face away from him, looking at her back. The Duke suddenly said her hair color was too light. She smiled and asked if the color was keeping him awake. But Shantak said no. He seemed to want to say something else, but in the end, he just touched her hair with his lips and fell back into a deep sleep. Sue's cheeks burned. She really wanted to know what he meant to say, but Shantak could no longer hear her. From the moment she woke up, she couldn't stop replaying what happened last night in her mind. The Duke was already awake, but the girl felt even the birds chirping outside the window were exceptionally loud and annoying. Monty stretched and began to take off his nightgown. Before Sue could understand what was happening, he suddenly leaned over her and told her to do the same. The Duke sighed and explained that the butler could enter the room at any moment. Just as he predicted, a knock sounded at the door. Just then, the butler walked into the bedroom and froze on the spot. The scene before him was incredibly awkward. A half-naked Shantak lay on his side in bed, covered only by a thin sheet, holding Miss Marlene tightly in his arms. The servant announced that breakfast was ready and retreated from the room. Only then did the Duke release Sue and begin to dress. She refused his offer to call a maid to help her change, feeling more comfortable alone. What happened last night kept lingering in her mind. Helen walked into the room, bade the young lady good morning, and handed her the dress she had prepared for Marlene. She urged her to hurry, as His Majesty the King had already arrived at the manor. Helen offered to help, and the girl gladly accepted. After Sue was ready, she went downstairs to the living room to greet His Majesty. It turned out the king had come to the Duke's mansion personally because he felt guilty about separating the newlyweds on their wedding day. But he promised it would only take a few weeks, as Shantak just needed to quell some unrest in the north. After listening to Javier, she turned around and looked at the Duke with eyes full of sorrow. The man remained expressionless, even though he was about to head to the battlefield. Sue walked up to Shantak and gently touched his shoulder. The Duke turned and saw that strange look on her face again. She had shown the same expression during the wedding rehearsal that night and during the wedding procession. Then, a tear suddenly welled up in her eye, slowly sliding down her cheek. Marlene covered her face with her hands, begging the Duke to be careful on the battlefield and take care of himself. She said she dared not imagine what she would do if anything happened to him. Monty pulled the girl close, embraced her gently, and promised to return safely. The king watched everything unfolding before him with a smile. Shantak told Marlene he would leave Fernando to protect her. Then, he picked up a lock of her hair and touched it lightly with his lips. At the same time, he whispered to Sue that he had already warned the butler to keep a close eye on the valuables in the mansion. The Duke strongly advised her not to even entertain the thought of pilfering anything. One day, after Shantok left Marymount, the prince took advantage of his absence to visit Marlene. She was extremely annoyed by his presence. Just because the Duke was out of the city didn't mean he could ignore her order to stay away. Arthur admitted that after so much time, he simply wanted to see Sue, using the wedding as an excuse. Before she could even answer, he smilingly suggested she get a divorce. The prince believed Shantok's departure was the perfect opportunity for them to separate, promising that no one would blame her for it. Sue warned Arthur that if he mentioned divorce one more time, she would throw him out with her own hands. The prince completely ignored her words, simply genuinely happy to be able to see her again. He told her that noble ladies usually host a small tea party after a wedding, but Sue hadn't organized any such event, so Arthur had come to confirm if she was all right. She confessed that she felt awkward in front of all those strangers. Arthur had been curious how she didn't get bored staying alone. To stop him from pressing further on this topic, Sue said she was incredibly busy now as a duchess. Aside from handling various affairs, she buried herself in books and cultivated some small hobbies. Arthur immediately perked up, wanting to know what kind of hobbies she liked. So she stood up, took a deck of cards from the dressing table, and asked if he wanted to play a round of ricotta. She figured since he had come specifically to see her, there surely wasn't anything urgent, so they might as well play a game. Arthur was stunned by her action, admitting that Sue was the only person who dared to treat him this way. Even facing a prince, she didn't back down, suggesting they add some stakes to make the game more interesting. She was desperate to know everything about the Duke, especially why the prince said he had handled Camilla. Additionally, she wanted to know how much truth there was to the rumors about Shantok. Put simply, that he had done some very terrible things to his older brother. This time, Sue was determined to squeeze all the information out of Arthur. The prince agreed and was about to state his conditions, but she interrupted him, declaring that divorce was off the table. An awkward silence filled the air. Because Sue was staring at Arthur so intensely, he didn't even dare finish his sentence. Then he gave a sly smile, saying that honestly, there wasn't really anything else he truly wanted. The girl told him to think hard, feeling he surely must want something else. Arthur held her hand, asking if that was the case, could he finally see what she looked like wearing that elf costume. Sue snorted in annoyance, not understanding why he was so obsessed with that silly outfit. Then Arthur confessed that he actually just wanted to hold her the way he held Cynthia. Although the girl was shocked by his honesty, she eventually agreed. Sue had no doubt she would win, as these kinds of games were completely her forte. The heroine and the prince went to the gazebo. Before dealing the cards, the girl asked about his skills. Arthur admitted he wasn't very good, as his expression always gave him away. But since Ricochet was a game among nobles, it wasn't unfamiliar to him. It turned out Camilla was the first person to teach the prince how to play this game. Seeing Sue freeze after he spoke, Arthur chuckled softly, as her reaction clearly told him what kind of intelligence she was trying to extract. The girl proposed starting the game, confident that an amateur like the prince couldn't beat a professional player. Just a few minutes later, Sue actually won. Arthur nearly dropped his jaw, but the girl just smiled, claiming the god of ricotta was clearly on her side. Since she won, Sue demanded the prince tell her everything about the Duke, starting from where he left off last time. She wanted to know what he meant by saying Beau's mother suffered because of Shantok. Arthur turned his head in annoyance, asking why the Duchess was inquiring about her own husband from him. In response, the girl squeezed out a tear, saying the Duke was hiding things from her that might hurt her feelings. As his wife, she just wanted to understand Shantok and comfort him. Arthur retorted that he could tell Sue everything, but only if she promised to divorce the Duke. His words thoroughly angered her, and the prince had no choice but to sit down and start telling his story. Although Shantok was the son of the Duke and a mistress, he showed amazing talent in fencing from a young age. The child was so outstanding that he caught the king's attention. And Camilla, the prince's etiquette teacher, had a secret crush on Shantok since childhood. She followed him everywhere, but he kept telling her to stop. Camilla was very angry at his coldness, calling him a bastard who probably didn't even have friends. She offered to be his friend, but he rejected her again. When she said there were many men who liked her, he just coldly told her to go to them and stop bothering him. But Camilla was obsessed with Shantok because she was convinced they were very alike. Like Shantok, she was also born to a duke's mistress, so she fully understood what it was like to live under a duchess's surveillance. Furthermore, Camilla firmly believed that both of them were more talented than the legitimate heirs. The girl thought this coincidence was simply fate's arrangement. Shantok was skeptical of this idea, as Camilla's sister was only 3 years old, so there was no way to know if she would be more talented when she grew up. Moreover, he never considered himself superior to his older brother. In his view, his brother was much more capable than him. Once, Camilla asked Arthur how she looked, and he said she was cute. Then she complained to him that Shantok kept rejecting her, probably because he preferred someone else. The girl asked the prince if he liked Cynthia, and the boy replied that he did. Camilla wanted to know if he liked that elf more than her, and Arthur confirmed it again. The girl was furious that she had actually lost to a plant. No matter how hard the prince tried to convince her that she was also important to him, Camilla only cared about being number one. She dramatically declared that her heart was now completely broken. When the prince turned 8, His Majesty appointed Shantok as his fencing instructor. Shantok handed Arthur a wooden practice sword, but the boy crushed it into splinters with just a squeeze of his hand. Although Shantok thought the prince just didn't like the weapon, he suddenly announced that the person he didn't like was Shantok. Shantok accepted this statement very calmly, not even asking why he hated him so much. This annoyed Arthur even more, and he ordered Shantok to ask him the reason. When the question was finally asked, the prince declared he was angry because Shantok had made Camilla suffer. However, the guy felt no obligation to be responsible for the girl's unrequited love. Arthur flew into a rage, swinging his fist at Shantok with his inhuman strength. But just as he lunged to attack, Shantok casually pushed him aside. Before the prince could react, the duke grabbed his wrist, causing him sharp pain. Shantok explained that Arthur needed to learn to control his impulses, because if he continued to swing his fist without thinking, he might break someone's bones. He himself was fine only because he managed to block the blow. Since the prince possessed extraordinary physical strength, Shantok suggested he do actual combat training and rolled up his sleeves. Arthur pointed out that fighting a royal was a crime, but the duke explained it was just sparring and ordered him to attack. A while later, the defeated prince lay face down on the ground. He was furious, threatening to throw Shantok in prison immediately. But the duke was just surprised the kid still had the energy to yell. Although Arthur screamed at him to never come near him again, Shantok said goodbye until the next lesson. On Shantok's way out, he met Camilla. She smiled and asked how his first lesson with the prince went. The girl pointed out that now he was a teacher to the prince, just like her. Shantok told Camilla to stop trying to find meaningless connections between them and live her own life. Sitting on the grass, Arthur watched Shantok break another girl's heart. The prince suddenly stopped his story and froze. Hearing some strange noises, Sue chuckled, guessing it might just be a raccoon. Arthur was terrified by the idea, as that kind of animal should absolutely not be near the castle. He stood up, peeked out, and saw a small child crawling around in the bushes. Sue admitted she knew the child. Then, she suddenly and accurately named every card in the prince's hand. When Arthur discovered exactly how the girl had won, he was stunned. The child had been hiding behind the prince, signaling to her what cards he was holding. Sue was caught red-handed, so she didn't deny it and thanked Arthur for the interesting game and the intelligence. By the time the prince shouted behind her about what a terrible person she was and that he would never play with her again, she had already left the gazebo. Now, the heroine knew the duke was illegitimate and that Beau's mother had been pestering him everywhere. Although this wasn't the information she had expected, Sue still managed to dig up something useful. Arriving at a courtyard on the other side of the estate, she tossed a gold coin to her little helper. As for their conversation with His Highness, the girl said the boy didn't need to know the details. Left alone in the gazebo, Arthur was thinking about Sue. That girl was always much more cunning and sharp than she first appeared, which puzzled the prince. Was everyone from Ardell like this? He decided to investigate. Meanwhile, our heroine changed into casual clothes and took her paperboy to the nearest tavern to treat him to lunch. She was surprised that no one seemed worried about the duke going to war. Unlike her, the child wasn't surprised at all. Sue thought it was because the duke returned safe and sound from the battlefield every time, but he said that wasn't it. The clever little guy signaled that he would only talk if she paid. Jang tossed the gold coin in his hand, thinking that since Sue was from Ardell, she surely didn't know the story everyone in Vahe knew. When she asked what he was talking about, he said it was the story about how the duke, well, got rid of his older brother to get the title. Who knows how much truth is in the rumors? But people say the former duke was in good health, and his sudden death was suspicious. Furthermore, It was no secret that His Majesty favored Shantok. Rumor had it that the king had directly suggested to the former duke that he pass the title to his younger brother. But he just laughed it off when he heard it. In the entire kingdom, you couldn't find a more decent noble than Theodore Merimont. In terms of swordsmanship and intellect, Shantok was far superior to him. But Theodore was a truly good person. The Duke always looked out for the common people in the back alleys, and many of them still remembered him fondly. Even so, it couldn't be said that Shantok had a bad reputation. Under his rule, the duchy had even begun to prosper. It was just that the former Duke was so beloved that people tried to be loyal to his memory. Shantok won the title Sword of Viltun at just 20 years old. He was more like a war hero than a lord, protecting the entire kingdom, not just Merimont. Whereas Theodore was the one who always stood with the people, guarding them up close. I suppose in people's eyes, Shantok seemed a bit cold and ruthless. But the thing is, our heroine had also seen a completely different side of the guy. Jang asked Sue if it was really okay for a duchess to leave the estate every day and hang out in a place like this. She explained that she felt more at ease this way. Otherwise, she'd be stuck in the estate entertaining the prince. And he was rushing her to divorce the duke for no reason. The child grinned smugly, saying that crazy bastard Arthur clearly had no taste. At their next meeting, a messenger brought Sue Mel's report card. She was very nervous as she opened the envelope, but her worries quickly vanished when she saw the good grades on the report. The child guessed that Mel was the Duchess's brother. Sue asked how he could tell. Jang explained that he had a younger brother too, and he knew how happy it felt to hear good news about family. Besides, Mel looked especially happy every time he received a letter from Sue. It was great to hear this news, because she had been really worried that leaving him during his awkward puberty might make him forget her. The child admitted he would be overjoyed to have a sister like her. Sue smiled and rubbed Jang's hair, knowing the little rascal only said that because she had treated him to a few meals. The child pointed out that she didn't look like a duchess at all when she did that. She smiled and told him that in this chaotic world, you have to find even tiny reasons to smile to make life worth living. Jang agreed, but he looked a bit depressed as he said it. It was getting late, time for dinner. So Sue handed the child a bag of bread to take to his brother. She told him to say he had earned it fair and square. Jang thanked Sue and confessed that thanks to her, life suddenly didn't seem so hard. He became awkward after the confession, so he said goodbye and ran home quickly. Left alone, she stretched out under the big tree, lost in thought. Every time she saw Jang, he reminded her of her own childhood, struggling to survive in the back alleys. Back then, Sue had longed for someone to lend her a hand. So Jang shouldn't thank her now, because by helping him, she was also helping the version of herself she saw in him. The Sue for back then had lived on the edge for so long that even her good deeds had become selfish. It was time to return to the estate. As she stood up, she noticed Jang had left his hat behind. She thought she could catch up to him if she hurried, so she ran after the child. Reaching the alley, she saw a large crowd gathered there. Sue decided to see what was happening too and started squeezing through the crowd. When she finally saw what everyone was surrounding, fear etched itself onto her face. The girl's hands went limp, and the hat she was holding fell to the ground. Jang, who had just been chatting happily with her under the tree, was leaning against the wall with a massive wound in his abdomen, while the bread she gave him lay scattered nearby. She walked over to the sobbing boy beside him, assuming it was his brother, and asked what happened. The boy just looked at her with wide, terrified eyes. He kept hiccuping, then started hugging Jang's body again. Sue realized he couldn't speak. She froze in place, not knowing how to tell a child to let go of his brother. She knew better than anyone that the body was already worth less than a handful of ash. Because Sue herself knew how pointless it was to live on while holding on to the dead. But children facing death for the first time didn't know that. That was why he was crying, tightly holding a body that would turn cold any moment. The heroine took off her cloak and covered Jang's body, promising to give him a decent funeral. She picked up the corpse and told the crying boy to follow her. But when Sue turned around, she was met with the scrutinizing gazes of the crowd. Sue had to turn and run in the other direction to avoid them. A holy king resided in Vahe, so no one except nobles could be buried in that land. For rats, roaming the alleys, returning to dust was an impossible dream. But even now, the death Sue had to face was not the death of a gutter rat. They were just children, like wildflowers that had yet to bloom. In a back alley, a strange man called out to Sue, telling her to dump the body on the ground. He blocked her path and declared that this brat's death should serve as a lesson to the other kids in the alley. That was exactly why the killer had left the body where it could be easily found. The kid was supposed to hand over 90% of his earnings, but the rascal tried to hide his income until the very end. Saying this, the killer walked towards Sue, wanting to snatch Jang's body from her hands. The heroine trembled with rage, disgusted that someone could be so vile as to kill a child. She cursed him as trash for extorting money, painstakingly saved by children much smaller than him, and acting as if it were something to be proud of. The killer completely lost it, shoving Sue and cursing her for being nosy, telling her to stay out of it. The girl fell, and he kept roaring, asking who she thought she was to dare interfere. The bastard decided to teach her a lesson she would never forget. He drew a dagger and raised it high, preparing to stab down. Sue hugged Jang's body tightly and closed her eyes. She said goodbye in her heart, but the blow never fell. When the heroine opened her eyes, she was shocked to see Shantok gripping the killer's arm. The scoundrel didn't even have time to react before the Duke smashed his head into the wall with all his might. He threatened to cut off the guy's head and hang it in the town square for public display, so everyone would know the consequence of committing murder in Merrimont. Sue gasped and pleaded with the Duke to stop. She explained that these people wouldn't back down anyway, and if he did that, they would retaliate against the children. Shantok threw the guy's limp body to the ground, turned around, and asked Sue what on earth she was thinking running to such a dangerous place. Only then did he notice the bloodstains on her cloak, the one she had used to cover the child in her arms. The Duke rushed to her side, terrified that the scoundrel had hurt her. The girl lowered her head and whispered that it wasn't her blood. Heavy rain poured down, and they stood like that for a moment. Neither could say a word. After finding a suitable spot, Sue and Shantok buried Jang. Sue patted his brother on the head and told him to go home. She said he could come visit the grave every day if he wanted. After the boy left, Shantok told Sue that he had handed the killer over to the city guard, and he would face justice. The Duke also increased security in the nearby alleys, so the children would be safe for the time being. Sue thanked him for looking after the other children and for allowing them to bury the boy here. This was exactly the place Jang liked to stay most when he was alive. He liked it here because the wind felt cool. It made him feel free. Shantok walked up to her, gently stroked her cheek, and told her not to cry. He wiped away a tear, and only then did she truly feel how much pain she was in. Jang's last words flashed through her mind, and the pain exploded instantly. Sue began to sob, and the Duke pulled her close, letting her lean against his chest to cry her heart out. She just couldn't understand how life could be such a mess.